August 9th, 1942. Somewhere off the coast of a jungle island most Americans had never heard of, four Allied warships are burning on the water. In the space of 32 minutes, the United States Navy has just suffered one of the worst defeats in its entire history. Over 1,000 sailors are dead or dying in the dark. And back in Washington, almost no one knows yet. This isn't the story of a battle America lost by being outgunned. This is the story of a fleet that was certain it was safe, certain the enemy was retreating, right up until the moment Japanese shells started finding their mark. And it's the story of what the United States government did in the weeks after, when the truth became too dangerous to tell. To understand what happened at Savo Island, you have to understand what August 1942 actually was for the American military. Guadalcanal was the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. 6 days earlier, Marines had stormed ashore, catching the Japanese garrison off guard and seizing an unfinished airfield. It felt, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, like momentum had shifted. Transport ships were anchored off the coast, unloading the food, fuel, and ammunition the Marines desperately needed to hold what they'd taken. Screening that vulnerable convoy were Allied cruisers and destroyers, American and Australian warships tasked with one job: make sure no Japanese fleet reached those transports. Command believed the greatest danger had already passed. They were wrong. Japan did not intend to give up Guadalcanal without a fight. Within hours of the American landing, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa was ordered to strike back. He assembled a scratch force of cruisers and a destroyer at Rabaul and set course south, sailing openly down what Allied reconnaissance pilots would later nickname the Slot, the channel running through the Solomon Islands Strait toward Guadalcanal. Australian and American aircraft actually spotted his force during the day. Reports were filed, but by the time that intelligence worked its way up the chain of command, it had been delayed, diluted, and misread. The assumption at Allied headquarters was simple, and it would prove catastrophic. Surely no sane Japanese commander would sail a small cruiser force straight into contested waters at night without air cover. That night, the Allied screening force was split into 3 separate patrol groups, watching different approaches to the anchorage, a defensive posture that made sense against a daylight threat, but left dangerous gaps in the dark. Radar was primitive and unreliable at these ranges among islands. Lookouts were exhausted after days of continuous alert. And crucially, commanders believed reconnaissance reports meant the Japanese force cited earlier was likely withdrawing, or at most planning a seaplane operation, not a full-scale night surface attack. Admiral Mikawa understood something the Allies hadn't fully reckoned with. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years training specifically for night combat, developing optics, torpedoes, and tactics built for exactly this scenario. The Allies were about to learn that lesson in the worst possible way. Just after midnight on August 9th, Mikawa's ships slipped past a picket destroyer without being detected, then split into 2 columns bearing down on the unsuspecting Allied cruisers. Japanese lookouts, trained for night vision and using superior optical rangefinders, spotted the Allied ships well before they themselves were seen. At 1:38 a.m., Mikawa gave the order to attack. Japanese cruisers launched their deadly Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, weapons with a range and destructive power far beyond anything in the American arsenal, and largely unknown to Allied intelligence at the time. Then the guns opened up. For the sailors aboard the Allied cruisers, the first sign of the attack wasn't a warning. It was the flash of searchlights suddenly illuminating their own ships, followed almost instantly by incoming fire. The Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was struck first and hardest. In the opening minutes, she took more than 20 hits from Japanese shellfire, including damage that tore through her bridge and engine spaces almost simultaneously. Her captain was mortally wounded within moments. Power failed across the ship. Without electricity, her guns couldn't be aimed or fired, and she was left drifting, burning, and utterly defenseless in the dark water while the battle raged on around her. Canberra never fired a single shot back. She would later be abandoned and scuttled by her own crew, a ship that had sailed into the night fully armed and combat-ready, destroyed before her gunners ever had the chance to engage the enemy that killed them. Mikawa's force then turned north, catching the second group of American cruisers, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, just as unprepared as the first. Quincy was caught in crossfire from both Japanese columns simultaneously, illuminated by searchlights from two directions while her crew was still scrambling to general quarters. Her captain reportedly turned to an officer and said he believed they'd sailed into their own supporting forces by mistake. That's how little warning there had been. Within minutes, Quincy was ablaze from bow to stern, her superstructure shattered by shell after shell. Vincennes suffered a similar fate, struck by torpedoes and gunfire before her crew could mount an effective response. Astoria managed to return fire, but was overwhelmed soon after. By roughly 2:16 a.m., it was over. In just over half an hour, for Allied heavy cruisers, Canberra, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were sunk or sinking. A fifth cruiser was damaged. Approximately 1,077 American and Australian sailors were dead, with hundreds more wounded, many of them burned or trapped below decks as their ships went down. Japanese losses, by comparison, were minimal, light damage to a handful of ships and only a few dozen casualties. It remains, to this day, one of the most lopsided naval defeats in United States Navy history. And remarkably, Mikawa's force withdrew from the battle almost entirely unscathed, choosing not to press the attack against the far more valuable, undefended transport ships still anchored just miles away. That decision to withdraw is one of the great what-ifs of the Pacific War. Had Mikawa turned his force toward the transports instead of retreating, he could have destroyed the supply ships the Marines on Guadalcanal desperately depended on, potentially crippling the entire American campaign before it truly began. Historians still debate why he pulled back. Fear of American carrier aircraft he believed were still in the area, uncertainty about his own fuel and ammunition, or simple caution after achieving a decisive tactical victory. Whatever the reason, his retreat meant the American foothold on Guadalcanal survived the night. But that small mercy did nothing to change what had just happened to the men on those four sunken cruisers, or what the Navy would now have to decide to do about it. In the days immediately following the battle, senior American commanders understood the scale of what had happened and understood exactly how damaging that truth could be. Guadalcanal was already a fragile, uncertain operation. Reporting a defeat of this magnitude risked shaking public confidence at a critical moment, potentially affecting morale, war bond sales, and enlistment. So a decision was made, quietly, at the highest levels. The full truth would not be released to the American public. Not yet. Official announcements in the days after Savo Island were vague, downplaying losses, avoiding specific ship names, and offering no clear picture of just how badly the Navy had been beaten in those 32 minutes off Guadalcanal. For the families of the men lost that night, the silence was its own kind of cruelty. Telegrams listing sailors as missing trickled out slowly, often without explanation of where or how. Some families would not learn the full details of what had happened to their sons, husbands, and brothers for weeks after the battle. The Navy's official public acknowledgement of the scale of the defeat was delayed until roughly a month later, long after the ships themselves had settled onto the ocean floor in waters that Allied sailors would grimly nickname Iron Bottom Sound for the sheer number of warships that would eventually rest there. By the time the public understood what Savo Island truly was, the news cycle had moved on, and the story never received the reckoning its scale deserved. Wartime censorship gave officials enormous legal cover to control this narrative. Reporters were restricted in what they could transmit from the Pacific Theater, Involuntary press guidelines encouraged newspapers to avoid publishing information that might aid the enemy or damage morale. In practice, this meant the government could simply choose not to disclose bad news without technically lying. Omission became the tool, not fabrication. Naval leadership justified the delay as operational necessity, revealing the full scale of losses, they argued, could tip off the Japanese about how badly the screening force had been depleted, inviting a follow-up attack. Whether that justification was genuine strategic caution or simple damage control depends on who you ask, and historians still argue about it today. Internally, the Navy did not let the disaster go unexamined. A formal board of inquiry was convened to determine how a screening force had been so completely surprised. The investigation exposed a chain of failures: the misread reconnaissance reports, the fragmented command structure, the assumption that no night attack would come. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, in overall command of the amphibious operation, and Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, commanding the screening force, both faced scrutiny, though ultimately neither was formally punished. The findings quietly reshaped how the Navy trained for night combat and radar use for the rest of the war. Lessons paid for in the blood of the men aboard Canberra, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes. Today, Savo Island remains one of the least remembered major defeats in American naval history, overshadowed by the successes that followed at Guadalcanal and beyond. But the wreckage of those four cruisers still lies in Iron Bottom Sound, alongside dozens of other ships lost in the brutal months of fighting that followed. What makes this battle so remarkable isn't simply the scale of the loss. It's how completely avoidable it felt in hindsight. A fleet that dismissed a spotted enemy force as low risk. A command structure too fragmented to react in time. And a government that decided, in the moment truth mattered most, that silence served the war effort better than honesty ever could. Savo Island is a reminder that the most dangerous moment in any war isn't when the enemy is strongest. It's when your own side is dead certain it's already safe. If this is the kind of history you don't get from a textbook, the moment's commanders were sure of victory right before disaster struck, and what got buried afterward, that's exactly what this channel is built around. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next episode. And if you want to know which battle we're uncovering next, drop it in the comments. Some of your suggestions have already become full episodes. Thanks for watching.